Good afternoon, everyone. I would love to take this opportunity to welcome you to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Michelle Struck. I am the Khosravi Chair in Principled Internationalism, the Director of the Human Rights Initiative, and the Director of our Humanitarian Agenda. It is my distinct pleasure to be able to introduce this event to you today. Before I do, I will do a quick announcement. Before we begin our program, I'll share with you our building safety precautions. Overall, we're very secure in our building, but as a convener, we have a duty to prepare for any eventuality. And so I will serve as your responsible safety officer for the event. Just follow my instructions if the need arises. And of course, take a moment to familiarize yourself with our emergency exit pathways for this room, which are just behind you. And if you need the restroom, just exit through the back. You can take a right and follow the signs down the hall. So without further ado, I will turn to our program today. So as you know, the Sustainable Development Goals have set very ambitious targets for implementation. And one of the most important goals that we'd like to focus on today is 8.7, which is calling for the end of forced labor by 2030 and all forms of child labor by 2025. Unfortunately, it is the case that around the world, forced labor has actually increased since the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed. This is despite the fact that governments, including the United States, have worked to prioritize this issue and have made progress on it. We also know that forced labor is an issue that affects every country. It affects the United States just as much as it affects developing countries around the world, but in different ways. So today, it is my pleasure to be able to introduce to you a program where we talk about the topic of ending forced labor. What will it take to get to the point where we can meet that sustainable development target, where no person around the world will be subject to forced labor? Today, you'll also hear about a report that was just released by the International Labor Organization that discusses forced labor and the characteristics of it around the world. In that report, we'll hear about how forced labor can be privately imposed, so from the private sector. That's actually about 86% of the problem around the world is in the private sector, and also state imposed. And we'll have a unique opportunity today to hear about what governments can do, what leverage do they have to be able to push corporate accountability and to hold governments, private actors accountable to ensure that forced labor is not being used in their supply chains. Today, I also wanted to mention as we kick off this event that while you'll hear in this conversation a lot of statistics, a lot of economic analysis, information about what kinds of sectors and priorities you'll find in this problem around the world, at the end of the day, there are about 28 million individuals, including 3.3 million children, who are living in forced labor. So it's extremely important that no matter what conversations we have at the policy level, at the end of the day, everyone here, I know many of you who are interested, many of you who are tuning in online, are interested in ending forced labor and thinking specifically about those individuals whose rights, whose labor has been stolen from them, whose rights are essentially taken away the moment that they enter this system. And the fact that the solution set is going to include things beyond maybe what you might expect in order to address it. So without further ado, I will introduce our keynote speaker. Today I have the pleasure to introduce Ambassador Cindy Dyer. Just one moment. Ambassador Dyer is the representative for trafficking in persons at the Department of State, has had a long, distinguished career, including work at the Department of Defense on the IRC, which is working to end sexual assault in the military. It is my pleasure to introduce her today to give an opening set of remarks. Thank you.
There's a little booster seat up here that I don't normally need. It is such a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to the CSIS Human Rights Initiative for inviting me to speak at this timely and important event. To our distinguished guests and panelists, thank you for your presence and for your commitment to this issue. We are here today to address an urgent and deeply troubling issue: forced labor. The statistics are staggering and sobering. As Michelle said, there are over 27 million people worldwide who are exploited in human trafficking, including forced labor. That's more than 27 million folks denied their fundamental human rights, more than 27 million folks whose stories of exploitation and suffering we just cannot continue to ignore. It is a call to action. Victims of forced labor are not just in far-off regions that are unconnected to us. They are in our communities, including here in the United States, and they are exploited in the supply chains of products that you and I use every day, and in industries that power our global economy. They are the unseen workers in factories and fields and on fishing boats. They are domestic workers who are isolated behind closed doors. They are the vulnerable individuals lured by false promises of a legitimate work, only to find themselves trapped in situations of exploitation and abuse. As we confront this immense challenge, one thing is clear: no government, NGO, company, or survivor can do this alone. Partnerships are not just beneficial, they are absolutely essential in our fight against forced labor. Addressing labor rights and forced labor in particular has been a top priority of the Biden-Harris administration. The administration's national security strategy recognizes that forced labor is not just a human rights issue. It is also a threat to global economic stability and security. By undermining legitimate businesses and fueling criminal networks, forced labor poses significant risks to international peace and prosperity. The President's memorandum on advancing worker empowerment, rights, and high labor standards globally, which was released late last year, further underscores our commitment to promoting labor rights as a cornerstone of our foreign policy and national security strategy. This memorandum recognizes that worker rights are human rights, and that by promoting better working conditions globally, we not only uphold our values, but also create a more stable and prosperous world. These strategies complement the administration's revised National Action Plan to combat human trafficking, which provides a comprehensive framework for addressing all forms of human trafficking, including forced labor. This plan emphasizes 4 key pillars: prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnerships. The National Action Plan recognizes that to truly make a dent in this global issue, we need to stop trafficking before it starts. We need to protect and support survivors. We need to bring perpetrators to justice, and we need to work collaboratively across sectors and borders. The plan calls for increased training for first responders, enhanced support services for survivors, strengthened law enforcement efforts, and, crucially, expanding partnerships with civil society, the private sector, and international partners. Together, these policies, along with the important foundation laid by the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, ground our international efforts in a strong commitment to addressing the issue at home and stress that partnerships are critical to success. They also recognize the connection between labor rights and human rights and the broader implications of this fight for global security and prosperity. At the State Department's Trafficking in Persons Office, we are committed to turning these policies into action. Our mission is to lead the United States' global engagement against human trafficking, including forced labor. We do this in 4 key ways. One, we assess 188 governments on their efforts to comprehensively address human trafficking through our annual Trafficking in Persons report. 2, we engage other countries diplomatically to raise this issue and promote partnership, both bilaterally and multilaterally. 3, we leverage foreign assistance to build the capacity of government and civil society actors to combat trafficking. And finally, we coordinate anti-trafficking efforts across the U.S. government and across the interagency. The latest TIP report, released by Secretary Blinken in June, highlights the prevalence of forced labor in countries and industries all over the world, in manufacturing, mining, construction, and other sectors. We believe governments have primary responsibility for addressing human trafficking and for investigating, prosecuting, and convicting those who engage in it and facilitate it. We use the TIP report and our diplomatic engagements to urge foreign governments to do more. And we use our programming to help strengthen their capacity to prevent trafficking, to protect victims, and to prosecute traffickers. One of our signature programs is the Program to End Modern Slavery. Of course, it has an acronym because it's DC, and it's the PIMS program. PIMS funding is cutting edge, and it invests in research to better understand trafficking issues in specific areas, and then to target programming to achieve a significant and measurable impact, including in preventing forced labor. Another flagship program of our office is the Child Protection Compact CPC partnerships, which aim to strengthen the capacity of foreign governments to combat the most vulnerable among us, child trafficking victims. Through the CPCs, we've partnered with countries like Ghana, Jamaica, the Philippines, and Peru to enhance child protection systems, improve law enforcement responses, and provide comprehensive services to child survivors. Through the CPCs, we've also been able to support efforts to prevent forced child labor. I am really proud to highlight one of our newest programs. It is the Partnership to Prevent Trafficking in Persons. It's actually based on the very successful CPC model, but the P2P model is available for all survivors, not just those that are children. It is a multi-year collaboration between the United States and partner countries to combat trafficking. It brings together diverse stakeholders, governments, civil society, and the private sector to design and implement comprehensive prevention strategies. It leverages the unique strengths of each partner to create sustainable, community-driven solutions. We were thrilled to launch our very first P2P just this past year with Zambia. Finally, I want to highlight an important new tool in our arsenal to combat labor trafficking: sanctions. Just last week, the Treasury Department, in coordination with our office and others at the State Department, imposed sanctions on an individual responsible for serious human rights abuses related to widespread forced labor in online scam operations in Cambodia. This action underscores the United States' commitment to imposing serious consequences on those who profit from forced labor and to protecting the thousands of victims and the American citizens targeted by these scams. In my role as Ambassador at Large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, I have witnessed the firsthand power of these collective actions. When governments, NGOs, and the private sector, international organizations work together, we create a formidable force against those who would exploit human beings for profit. Collaboration allows us to pool resources, share expertise, and coordinate efforts, which increases our impact. Governments and international organizations set the legal and policy frameworks that define and criminalize forced labor. They negotiate international agreements. They enforce laws and hold traffickers accountable. Our government-to-government partnerships, like the P2P and CPCs, and our joint statement with Brazil on workers' rights, allow us to align our efforts and create a unified front against forced labor. NGOs are also critical in this fight. They provide vital services to survivors, conduct research to inform policy, and they advocate for stronger protections. The private sector, too, has the power to transform supply chains, implement responsible labor practices, and set industry standards. An outstanding example of our partnership with the private sector is the Responsible Sourcing Tool, which provides companies, contractors, and consumers with risk mapping tools, research on key sectors and commodities, and guidance on effective management systems. The Responsible Resourcing Tool was developed in collaboration with Verite. It's a nonprofit organization helping to shed light on labor rights violations in supply chains. And the tool demonstrates how governments, NGOs, and the private sector can work together to prevent forced labor in global supply chains. But our most important partners in the fight against human trafficking are survivors themselves. Their lived experiences, insights, and perspectives are invaluable in shaping effective policies and programs. By centering survivor voices, we ensure our approaches are empathetic and truly responsive to the needs of those we aim to help. In the TIP office, for example, we work closely with the National Survivor Network, a coalition of trafficking survivors that has been instrumental in shaping U.S. anti-trafficking policies. Their input has led to a more trauma-informed approach in law enforcement interactions and potential victims, and has influenced policies to better protect survivors' rights. We all have a role to play in this fight, from government agencies to businesses, from international organizations to grassroots NGOs, and most importantly, to survivors themselves. The more we collaborate, the more effective we are. I would ask each of you to renew your commitment to this cause. Whether you're a policymaker, a business leader, an activist, or a concerned citizen, your efforts really matter. Together, we can work to create a world where no one is subjected to the indignity and cruelty of forced labor. Thank you all for being here today and for your dedication to this issue. While the challenges before us are certainly significant, I really remain optimistic. With continued partnership, unwavering commitment, and coordinated action, I believe we can and we will eradicate forced labor in our lifetime. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you again, and thank you so much again, Ambassador Dyer, for those inspiring remarks, particularly thinking about, this idea of the indignity and cruelty of forced labor, but the optimism, contrasting it with the optimism of being able to end it in our lifetimes. That's a really powerful statement to begin with. So we will have this, a distinguished panel discussion, and following the panel discussion this evening, we will have a closing set of remarks, and then after that, you'll all be invited to join us at a reception following. If you'd like to submit a question, there's a way to do that. There's an online submission form that you're able to use, and you can write the question into the chat, and for those that are joining us online, you also have the opportunity to do that. That will be part of the way that we'll derive questions in the Q&A session after this. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our two distinguished panelists. So we have joining us from Geneva, Manuela Tomei. And Manuela is the Assistant Director General on Governance, Rights, and Dialogue at the International Labor Organization, where she's worked since 1988. She's played pivotal roles in adopting domestic workers and violence and harassment conventions and led the Equal Pay International Coalition. And in addition to her influential roles at the ILO, she's a member of the Advisory Council of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership and many other distinguished parts of her background that you can find in the biography online. And then I also have next to us Thea Lee, who's the Deputy Undersecretary for International Affairs in the Biden-Harris administration. She's been advocating for workers' rights, both domestically and internationally, for over 30 years. She was president of the Economic Policy Institute, which is a progressive pro-worker Washington think tank from January 2018 to May 2021. And she was also an international trade economist. And then she also worked at the AFL-CIO, where she served as Deputy Chief of Staff, Policy Director, and also Chief International Economist. She's been on a number of government advisory committees at the State Department, the Ex-Im Bank, and a whole list of other affiliations. I'm absolutely delighted to have Thea coming back to join us today at CSIS and to have Manuela joining us from Geneva. So I will start off with Manuela with a question for you. I know that the ILO has released some recent research that's talking about forced labor, and I would love if you could tell us a little bit about that, and specifically, why forced labor is still an issue today. I know people that in this room follow this issue closely, but there are many people maybe watching online that don't follow it and might be surprised at how big of a problem it is. So we'd love to hear your sense of why is it still an issue, and what are some of the areas that where it's really the worst?
Yes, well, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for having me here. I also was very much impressed by the passion and the hope which is contained in the remarks which were delivered by Ambassador Dyer. I'm quite actually also struck by the very important initiatives that have been taken by the Biden administration in terms of tackling this very ugly and persistent problem. So, this is a clear priority of the U.S. government, so kudos to the U.S. government, with which we have been working actually very closely in terms of addressing the issue also across the world. So when you mentioned earlier on some of the figures, right? We are talking of a big problem, 28 million people who are in forced labor. And what is worrisome is that forced labor is increasing. It has increased by 2.6 million since 2016, despite the many efforts that have been deployed by different countries across the world. And what I think is very important also for policy purposes and from the viewpoint of what type of responses and action to take to address this scourge is that this growth in the number of forced laborers has been driven by the increase of forced laborers in the private sector. I mean, forced labor exacted by private agents, and the profitability of forced labor has increased tremendously. So, this, I think, gives you a scale of the problem. As you know, forced labor is also enacted by states, right? And therefore, the type of action that is to be taken varies significantly depending on what is the source or the nature of the perpetrators, the sectors in which it manifests itself. Another very important issue, I think, that came up from our research is that there are sectors in which the prevalence of forced labor is higher. And this is definitely the construction sector, for instance. So when we are comparing the proportion of forced laborers relative to the workforce, which is working in that particular sector, construction and manufacturing are those with the highest prevalence. So again, this is another piece of information which provide some tips in terms also of how to target interventions and set priorities. Now, why is it a persistent problem? And by the way, you also raised a very important issue at the beginning, which is that contrary to what many people may think, forced labor is not a problem which is confined to developing countries. It's not an issue of poverty only. Of course, there are links to poverty. But forced labor, the proportion of forced labor is higher in upper middle-income countries and higher-income countries. So again, from a policy viewpoint, this tells us a lot, because rich countries can address the issue. So I'm, but funding, we always hear about the fact that funding is an issue, is a problem, certainly, but it cannot be used as a pretext for inaction. Why is it so waterproof? Why is it so persistent and stubborn? Because it has some well, besides the profitability issue, which is quite important, an important issue to take into account. There are some root causes which are really at the heart of the existence of forced labor. And one of these is also linked to the denial of fundamental principles and rights at work for many workers around the world, including in rich economies. So, fighting towards improving the respect and observance of freedom of association, collective bargaining, the abolition of child labor, non-discrimination is absolutely essential. The other issue is also linked to the fact of who is concerned or who is affected by forced labor. I'm talking now from the viewpoint of those who are trapped in forced labor. It's usually the most vulnerable segments of the population. And our results are quite striking. Migrant workers are 3 times more likely than nationals to be trapped in forced labor. And this, of course, raises issues relating to recruitment practices, not only within countries, but across borders. And this, therefore, also highlight how important it is cooperation, bilateral cooperation, multilateral cooperation, engaging with other countries that may indeed be pursuing similar, a similar or a common sort of agenda. So another and last point, because I know that you have quite a number of questions, I think that there is a lot of resistance towards acknowledging that there is forced labor. So, if you do not accept or recognize that there are problems of forced labor, you will never be able to address it. And recognize that it exists, it means also measuring it. And sometimes the results may be very uncomfortable. And this, across all countries. So you cannot deal with a problem if you are not recognizing that it exists and that you want to address it. So I will stop here.
Well, thank you so much. And those are such important insights. And thank you for those. The idea that migrant workers are 3 times more likely, the scale of the problem, the fact that it's in higher, actually in richer countries is a fascinating insight and very important. And also just the idea that the results are uncomfortable. I think on a lot of the human rights issues that we bring into this building, into the Center for Strategic and International Studies, these are things where the data makes people uncomfortable, but that also can compel action. So that, I think, is a great transition into my question for Deputy Undersecretary Lee. We understand combating forced labor is a very important priority for your office. We also know that you use data substantially to address it. So it would be really interesting to hear, how is the U.S. government addressing forced labor? and how do you work with other actors like the ILO in order to address this issue of trying to end it by 2030?
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Manuela, for your excellent remarks. And this is such a big challenge for all of us, and I think the new ILO report is really important because it gives us a little bit more insight into where, how, who this problem occurs. And I think Manuela's last point is very important. What we try to do at ILAB, the International Labor Affairs Bureau, is to make sure that we are providing more of that baseline information. And we hope that information is useful not just to our counterparts in the US government, but to the private sector, to unions, to other governments. And some of what we do is really around wanting to make sure that we understand. We just released recently our list of goods produced with forced or child labor. And we added 72 goods this year. And we have also been doing new work on supply chain tracing that the US Congress has asked us to do. They asked us to look not just at where a good might be produced with forced labor, but a good could contain inputs that are made with forced labor, which dramatically expands the universe of what we are looking at. Because if you think about, for example, palm oil, and then you think of where that palm oil ends up in consumer products, in processed foods, and about a zillion things, and toothpaste, whatever, it's going to be everywhere. But that means that if we are serious about eradicating forced labor, we have to know where it starts and where it ends. And so I think the transparency is an important piece. The other piece, for the US government is what we call the whole of government approach. And President Biden has asked the entire US government to take a hard look at all the work they do internationally and to make sure that we are centering worker rights and all the worker rights. I think Manuela's point about the interconnectedness of the core labor rights, that not just saying we want to get rid of forced labor and we're going to do it in a vacuum, but when we look at forced labor, we're also looking at freedom of association and collective bargaining. We're also looking at discrimination. We are looking at safety and health at work, all the different and child labor, because they're connected to each other. And so we know that part of what we need to do is to be able to look at the root causes of what's happening. And we look at poverty, we look at lack of social protection, but also I think it's really important that we are focusing on vulnerable populations. And why are they vulnerable? Migrant workers, this comes right out, jumps out off the page at this most recent report, 3 times more likely to be subject to forced labor. And why is that? It is because we have somehow, throughout this, lost our common humanity. That when workers, any group of workers, whether they are migrant workers or a racial or ethnic or religious minority, are looked at as less than human, then I think it's both policymakers and businesses can justify treating them as less than human. And so, for me, getting back to making sure that our labor laws are in compliance with ILO standards, that we are allowing workers to form and join unions and to bargain collectively. We are giving them a voice in the political system as well as at the workplace. Those are the key pieces of centering worker voice and worker power and thinking how we can use all of the tools at our disposal, whether it's our technical assistance, our research, our trade enforcement and monitoring, our labor diplomacy to make sure that we are engaging with like-minded governments and also with not like-minded governments. So I think we have a lot of challenges ahead of us, but we're really pleased to be able to partner with the ILO. The ILO has been such an important partner for us, and we are proud to support this research and others like the Global Estimates on Modern Slavery, which ILO produces in partnership with the International Organization for Migration and Walk Free. And of course, we have a lot of really important technical assistance projects that the ILO is implementing for us all around the world. We'll talk more about that later.
Thank you. I really appreciate the response and also the highlighting that you're doing about how interconnected these issues are. And I was wondering, Manuela, if you could talk a little bit about that interconnectedness, because I understand from my read of the report that these solutions, they are, you can essentially assign a cost to what kinds of solutions a government might be able to take. but it might not be comprehensive. So if you could talk a little bit about what those gaps are, what are the things that are needed in order to address this as a holistic problem? What can we estimate, what can we not, based on the ILO's research?
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much for this question. Indeed, what we tried to do in the report that has been, we are discussing today, was to get a better sense of what might be the cost of addressing forced labor, taking into account the protocol, ILO's protocol to Convention 29 on forced labor. Because as Thea was saying, the job of the ILO is not only to come up with new international labor standards, but also to monitor implementation of these standards and then engage with governments that might be facing difficulties, challenges in implementing those standards to identify solutions to the problem. So it's a very sort of, dialogue type of engagement. And so it's always very important. I mean, policymakers are interested in knowing, okay, what is the price tag? How much is this going to cost me? And how long is it going to take to fix the problem? Well, I mean, it's obvious that fixing such a problem is not going to take, an administration, for instance. Mm-hmm. It's really a long-term journey. Right? And there are a number of key elements that need to be taken into account, and Thea Lee already alluded to some of them. But what I would like to say is that what we were trying to cost, and this is, of course, it's a preliminary attempt, an effort, which has been tried for the first time ever, to quantify the cost in relation to, for instance, contributing to the dissemination of information, awareness raising at different levels about what is forced labor, how does it manifest itself, where it takes place, who is involved, etc. And also, what are the remedies, mechanisms that are available in order to seek remedial action if needed. The other big component relates, of course, to the protection of victims of forced labor, which includes also measures related to compensation, rehabilitation. These are people who have significant traumas, right, of a psychological and also physical nature. So this is something that has to be factored in as well. And then enforcement. Enforcement is essential. I mean, we need to have laws that are clear in terms of saying what is forced labor, what is not forced labor, who is responsible for what are the measures that are to be taken. But then those laws need to be enacted. And what we are observing across the world, there's a serious implementation gap. So enforcement is a very important dimension of it. But enforcement is not only about training existing labor inspectorates that are, verifying compliance with the law, but it is also strengthening the capacity of institutions, of public agencies that need to deliver on these different fronts. And very often, public administration, and in particular, the labor administration, is the Cinderella, if you allowed this expression, as the Cinderella within the architecture of the public services. So if we want really to raise the visibility of this issue, we need to acknowledge that labor administration and ministries of labor play a very important role, but alone they will not be able to go that far. And hence the importance of coordination across and government as a whole approach. It is absolutely essential because of the interconnectedness of the problem, because of the issue of migrant workers being particularly affected by forced labor. I mean, this is also linked to the migration policies, to recruitment policies that are in place and programs, very often, I mean, the recruitment industry is so opaque. There is such a complexity of layers and multiple actors that operate in the Wild West. So I think this is another very important part of the equation if we are serious about also addressing, as Thea Lee was saying, taking into account the fact that not all the population is equally at risk of falling into forced labor. And among those who fall into forced labor, there are also some people who face multiple intersecting vulnerabilities. And this has to be recognized, because otherwise it's leaving them behind and not addressing the crack of the matter.
Thank you. I really also appreciate your connection. I mean, as we sit here in DC, in a place in the US, which is very concerned with the government's budget, the mandates of different institutions, the administration of policies. It sounds a little bit mundane, but that is the building blocks of how these problems can be addressed. So I appreciate the way you've connected that to what I think of when I hear you speak is essentially the false promises that people are lured into when they end up in forced labor, the vulnerabilities that they're facing, whether they're a refugee or a migrant that is in an economically dependent situation, can't make a livelihood and thinks they're about to find a better life, but instead they're trapped into this kind of forced servitude. That connection of that, policy level choices and investments to those actual people is really essential. So I would love to ask Thea, I know you've traveled around the world looking at different sectors and industries, looking at what does forced labor look like in practice. And I think that unique vantage point you have would make it really interesting to hear what insights you have about what does the targeting of this problem look like in practice when you're out in the world talking to people that are trying to address it?
Thank you, Michelle, for that question. I think that when you go out in the world and you talk to governments and workers and unions about forced labor, what you really do see is a system that is connected in its iniquity. You see poverty, exploitation, and corruption. One of the numbers that jumped out at me from the ILO report was $236 billion. That is the profit from forced labor globally. That is how much money is going into corporate or business profits, business pockets from that. And I think for us as a government, part of our goal is to take the profit out of exploitation. And we can do that through some of the trade measures, the trade enforcement measures, whether it's the forced labor enforcement, the forced labor import ban in the United States, now Mexico and Canada also have in place, the European Union's due diligence. These are ways for governments to put in place consistent, transparent, enforceable measures to let businesses know and to let everybody know, like, what is unacceptable, what is outside the realm of what is humanly acceptable in the world. And so, corporations need to change their processes. They need to take more responsibility for their entire supply chain. Not just tier 1, not just tier 2, but tier infinity, down to the bottom, because the money's at the top. That's where the profits are made. We're buying goods every day. You and I are buying goods every day that are tainted by forced labor or child labor or other labor abuses. We can't help it. I'm probably the most informed consumer in the world, because this is what I spend my life doing. I cannot avoid, whether it's an electric vehicle battery or it is clothing or it is food, it is seafood on my plate. I can't avoid it because there's not enough information out there. There are not enough clean supply chains out there to do that. And so I think Manuela talked about sort of the different pieces. One is knowledge. We need more national surveys, and iLab has funded a lot of national surveys of forced labor, just to kind of really encourage and reward governments that are willing to turn the light on and see or pick up the tree trunk and see what's underneath it. Because if we don't know, we can't fix it. And then the other is, that holistic set of policies to bring labor laws into compliance with the ILO standards. We know what the standards are. We know what compliance looks like. We, along with the ILO, are often advising, guiding companies about coming into compliance. And then the enforcement. Manuela, you said it's so important that governments, every government, needs to devote the resources that are needed to enforcing their labor laws. Because if you don't have a single labor inspector or a labor inspector who is trained or paid adequately so that they're not going to take bribes in order to be able to survive and feed their kids, then it's not going to matter. And then the other piece is social protection. We know how important that is, that if there is desperate poverty, if people get sick and fall into desperate poverty, then forced labor or child labor or both will often be a consequence of that. But and Manuela, I like what you said about labor being the Cinderella. And I talk about this sometimes about the hierarchy within governments. That in a lot of the governments that I visit, a lot of the countries that I visit, sometimes the labor minister will say to me, Thea, I understand what you're saying, that I need to bring the laws into compliance, I need to put more resources, but I lost the battle with the finance minister. The finance minister told me that enforcing labor law is going to drive away foreign investment. It's going to drive away business. It's going to kill jobs. And so the finance minister outranks the labor minister in pretty much every country, including this one. But if we can't win those battles, then it's not going to make a difference. And that's why we're so excited about the global labor strategy and the presidential memorandum that President Biden has put forward that is essentially trying to change that hierarchy and trying to lift labor up a little bit from the very bottom of that hierarchy to somewhere in the middle or maybe near the top. Because in this administration, labor rights really is part of that. And so, the foreign affairs, the trade, the customs, the migration, all the pieces of government that deal with the different challenges there need to be talking to each other at a minimum, but they also need to be putting a higher value on the importance of worker rights, even if it costs more in government procurement or it is going to require us to do things differently than we have done them in the past. What we're doing is not working, and that's why forced labor is growing. Forced labor is growing. That is a shameful fact. We are a wealthy country. We're getting wealthier. We have a wealthy world. We have technology, but we are not using that technology and the wealth to the end of protecting the common humanity of the people who are in the fields, on the boats, in the mines, in the factories, and who are being robbed, essentially. Actually, just one more thing I want to say about recruitment, because I think recruitment is so important that when we have corrupt recruitment practices where people are victimized and lied to, as Ambassador Dyer said, that's robbing not just the workers, but it's actually robbing the employers, too, because these unscrupulous middlemen are lying to workers, taking a huge chunk of their savings, their life savings, sometimes their entire community's life savings, and bringing them to a foreign country where they're abused. And when that happens, the employer's not getting the full value, the worker's not getting the full value, and some jerk in the middle is stealing from everybody. But it is the government's job in that case, I think, to make sure, and that's why it's so important that the governments from the sending and the receiving countries are in conversation with each other, as we are trying to do with our Central American counterparts with our root causes strategy.
If I may, I know that you have another question,
No,
but
sure.
I mean, it's just, this final remark by Thea, we have estimated what is the cost for migrant workers who are recruited, cross-border, that they pay for fees and other costs, right? So they have, these amounts to $5.6 billion globally. Wow. So you can imagine when, in order to be able to cross borders to obtain an employment, which has been offered to you, right? So there is deception of wages, of working time, of the content of the job that has been promised to you. And then on top of that, you have to pay in order to get a job. I mean, this is something which goes against all the, the fundamental principles, right? I mean, a worker that has to pay in order to provide his or her services to the employer. So, I mean, these really contribute to the vulnerability of migrant workers and make vulnerability to be trapped into debt bondage because they have to pay. We have made some costing again, and in some areas, some regions of the world, these paying the debt back in order for them to be able to have access to employment and cross borders, etc., may correspond to 1 year's salary. So you understand how these conditions contribute to enhance the vulnerability to be trapped into forced labor. And this is why it's so important, the respect of fundamental principles and rights at work. Voice at work, representative organization. Because here we are talking of very poor working conditions. If we don't deal with that and improve also the respect of labor rights besides the fundamental principles and rights at work, this is really a very important source for indeed falling trapped into forced labor. So everything is connected, and this is why we need to have a systemic approach, and this is why it's so important to invest in institutions and their capacity to detect instances of forced labor, to connect with other parts, not only of government, with other actors as well. And I think there was something I liked very much about what the ambassador said. That it's not only a whole of government approach that we need, it's a whole of society approach that we need. I mean, the insights that also we need to get from survivors in terms of what is the type of support that they need, but also understanding better the dynamics of forced labor and how you get trapped into it is absolutely essential.
These are such important points. I want to build on one theme that's come up, which is this idea that, investing in ending forced labor is costly. And it's costly to a variety of actors, including, as you mentioned, the very people that are trapped into it and that are investing in what they think is their future. Is there a benefit? Is there, when those people are, when this scourge is ended and those people are integrated back into society, and they become workers with hopefully good jobs, with benefits, with appropriate work conditions, is there an economic benefit to globally for that? Yeah.
Yes, again, I mean, this is part of the exercise we have engaged in. We have not only tried to estimate how much it might cost to address forced labor, we have also tried to estimate what the benefits of addressing forced labor might be. Because of a number of limitations in terms of data, methodological, approaches, etc., we have tried to measure what the benefits would be from eradicating forced labor and integrating former forced laborers into the labor market, into formal labor markets with decent jobs. The implications for aggregate demand, so the impact that it would have on aggregate demand. And if we were actually to shift these illegal profits from the pockets of perpetrators to the pockets of the workers themselves, these would result, according to our estimates, into an increase of $611 billion globally, right? Which would correspond to 0.41% of the global GDP. So this without taking into account all the positive effect and spillover effects stemming from a more healthier workforce. So what is the impact of forced labor on health, right? What is the impact for growth, on productivity, on skills enhancement? So, there is a plethora of issues and ramifications that we would like to investigate more. We have not been able yet to estimate what the positive effects would be on those other dimensions, but so more in terms of aggregate demand.
That makes sense, and I think bringing up the consumers, Thea, was really interesting too. The idea that all of us are consumers, and there's a merit as well to the moral value which consumers are now demanding, and they're seeing that in the way businesses are thinking of changing this issue, so that they are not looking at all of their products and understanding that it could come from forced labor. I think I'll just end with, before we take the audience Q&A, just one final question, which is, we heard about this contrast between the kind of shameful place that the world is currently in terms of not meeting the SDG, and a place of optimism about the fact that solutions are possible. This can be ended. It can be ended in our lifetime. I would love to hear more about how each of you is thinking about that. What brings you optimism, if anything, and what urgent step needs to be taken to bring us much closer to ending forced labor? I don't know who wants to go first. I'll call on Thea.
I'll jump in. Well, thank you, Michelle, for that question, because I think optimism is so important. We have to get up every morning. We have to keep doing this work, and we can't be mired in despair. That's not gonna be motivating. And I am optimistic because I look around. You're all here, and but I also think there's a global conversation about this happening, where, as you say, Michelle, legislators and consumers and business leaders and workers are rejecting this model. It doesn't work. It doesn't work for responsible businesses. They don't want to find themselves dragged across the front pages of the New York Times with horrific stories. They've invested in their brand names. They've invested in their company integrity. But we see, I think I mentioned the European Union, but also the UK, Germany, France, Canada, Mexico, the United States, Australia. People are moving in the right direction. And I think we're starting to change the culture, the way we talk about this, what is acceptable. For a long time, as you said, Michelle, I've been in this work for more than 30 years. You don't have to do the math. I was 12. And for, in the early 90s, companies like Nike used to say, oh, well, it's rough out there. We can't possibly be expected to know what's in our supply chain. We have thousands of subcontractors. It's so complicated. It's so difficult. And for the most part, people were like, yeah, that does sound hard. Thousands of subcontractors, I couldn't keep track of them either. But I think we've moved to another place, which is an understanding that if we can center workers and workers' voices and workers' democratic organizations in this work, we're actually going to be much more effective than we are when we try to do it with social audits and other sort of superficial kinds of exercises. And so that gives me hope. I see workers are, forming organizations, and governments are working with each other to share information. We have a partnership with Brazil, the U.S.-Brazil Partnership for Workers' Rights, which is something that gives me a lot of hope, that we have two of the most pro-union, pro-worker presidents in the world, President Biden and President Lula, who've come together to say, we want to bring our forces together to address forced labor, to address racial and gender inequity, to address climate change, and we want to do it with other countries that are willing to join in. So that gives me hope.
Thank you.
I subscribe 100%. What has been said, I'm also an optimist. So, otherwise, what the hell are we doing here? So we need to continue to hope. And hope is not just based on, peace and love type of considerations. It's also grounded on the fact that we have experiences that have worked. I keep referring to the case of Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan has eradicated forced labor. And this has been the result of 8 years of work and commitment and work with the governments, with the employers and the workers' organization. And it was a whole of government approach that eventually it started by attacking forced labor, then, okay, well, there is also child labor involved. Oh my God, so let's deal also with child labor. And eventually, there was the government that decided to start also investing in social protection in the root causes of forced labor. So, I mean, it can work, okay? And then I think there is an enhanced awareness and realization across countries and across actors that forced labor is I mean, besides the huge human suffering that it entails, is really liability. There is a reputational risk for companies. There is also, I mean, risks. Now I'm talking more about state-imposed, forced labor. For states that are relying on it for development purposes or for as a means of political coercion. So, I mean, things are changing. In the ILO, we have adopted, not the ILO, not the office, our tripartite constituents, the governments, ministries of labor, employers and workers organization from across the world have joined forces to adopt this protocol to Convention 29. And this protocol has really meant a shift in terms of how we address the problem. So, I mean, there is also a reflection in terms of what are the strategies, what are the approaches that can work. There is a growing we have also a wealth of tools, etc., that have been tested. Now we need really to bring all these efforts together, and I think that we are definitely here in order to continue to engage in this common fight against forced labor.
I appreciate that, and especially given how you've both dedicated your lives to this issue. Hearing your optimism makes me much more optimistic as well. We have some great questions from the audience. Of course, we only have time. I'm going to choose one. I will just preview them because we need future conversations on these. I'll preview some of the topics that came up in the questions so that as you are engaging with us, it gives us great fodder to continue this. We have questions on the de minimis provision in the U.S. government, on specific initiatives the U.S. is considering to eliminate goods produced by forced labor from the global economy, questions about what finance institutions can do to go the extra mile in addressing it in their supply chains, global trade, collaboration, and artificial intelligence. How is that going to change developing new products and ways to deliver them? So I'm taking all of those, my moderator prerogative, and saying that's for a future conversation. Those are very rich questions. The one I wanted to end on is this question we received, which is about a fundamental set of labor rights. I think bringing it back to this audience of why and how is the freedom of association, the right to organize and collectively bargain, why is that essential to combat forced labor? Because I think people that don't work on this issue may not understand the links. But from everything that I've read so far, it seems like that is a core part of the puzzle. So it would be great to understand, would either of you to answer that question of, why are those fundamental rights so important?
Because they're interconnected. So, I mean, if you... Okay, why? I mean, just let me trace the interlinkages, right? If you don't have voice, if you cannot organize in order to somehow counter coercion or try to negotiate better working conditions, if you do not count on other co-workers that together that share a sort of common concerns and are able to push a common agenda and common demands and requests, the likelihood that working conditions will improve and that the likelihood that you will not be trapped into forced labor, especially if you are a migrant, especially if you are a domestic worker. I'm thinking of domestic workers. I have worked a lot on this issue. Domestic workers is actually work which takes place behind closed doors, as the ambassador said. There are no co-workers around. Very often they are migrant workers. They don't speak the language of the country hosting them. they have no recourse. They don't know where to go to in order to know whether the treatment that she, because it's mainly women, is subject to is fair or not. So, and this is linked again to discrimination. Right? Why the large majority of domestic workers in the world are women? And why care work and domestic work is so undervalued? Because it is seen as having absolutely not entailing any responsibilities. All women were born knowing how to cook and how to iron and how to take care of children, right? I mean, this is inscribed in our DNA. So there are a number of assumptions that that are so entrenched in societies that justify discriminatory behavior and enhance the vulnerability of these women and these workers to actually demand what is due to them, right? And then again, if you are, operating in a hazardous working environment in which the likelihood that you will become sick or that you may you may develop a disability, an inability to continue to work, because OSH, as you know, is one of the fundamental principles on right at work, which has been recently added to the other four. This, of course, again, if you do not have social protection, any buffer to rely on, this means that either you are going to rely on the labor of your children, or that you will have, again, to endebt yourself in order to be able to make ends meet with, all the other implications. So all these elements are interconnected. But voice, representing, having voice and representation is about dignity, is about the ability to articulate, how you intend also to engage and contribute to a common project, a societal project. It's not just a matter of saying, I want more, I demand more. It's shaping a model of society that we all would be proud to stand for. So I think this is why we're interconnected and why it's important to promote and respect that.
Well, thank you so much. I am so honored to have been able to moderate this panel. If you could please join me in a round of applause for the distinguished panelists. In closing, I will introduce our last speaker, and then we will take our seats. Fernando de Oliveira Sena is the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of Brazil to the United States. He's a career diplomat with more than 27 years of experience in political, economic, consular, and international affairs in Brazil and abroad, including serving as Minister Counselor at the Brazilian Embassy in D.C. since July 1st, 2024. And he also served as Deputy Consul General at the Consulate General of Brazil in New York. We're glad we got you from New York. And previously worked as the head of Human Rights Division in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we will take our seats, but just wanted to say thank you so much for closing us out.
Thank you so much, and I'm really honored, and I thank CSIS for the opportunity to give the closing remarks after today's fruitful discussions. As our keynote speaker and our panelists highlighted, the eradication of forced labor is an issue that deeply touches on the values of human dignity and social justice, and I join their call that forced labor must end now, and that we need a whole society approach and international cooperation. The Brazilian history is marked by struggles for workers' rights and efforts to eliminate practices analogous to slavery lie at the heart of our public policies. I would first like to emphasize that strengthening workers' rights is a fundamental concern of my government. In Brazil's relations with the United States, These key objectives was reflected in the high-level understanding adopted in September 2023 when Presidents Lula and Biden launched the U.S.-Brazil Partnership for Workers' Rights, as mentioned by Ambassador Cindy Dyer and Thea Lee just now. Within the framework of this partnership, we have been working on seven priority lines of action around issues facing workers today, and the first of this line is exactly combating forced labor, the focus of today's events. So for these closing remarks, I would like to take this opportunity to share some of the efforts that have been made in Brazil to combat the scourge of forced labor. One of the fundamental milestones was the establishment of the National Plan for the Eradication of Slave Labor, as we call there, forced labor, launched in 2003 and updated over the years, and we expect a new version coming soon that will address issues like domestic workers that was mentioned, also reflecting on gender, race, and post-rescue efforts. But the plan calls for a series of coordinated actions between different government agencies and civil society to eliminate all forms of forced labor in Brazil. The plan operates on four main pillars. The first, enforcing the law and prosecuting those criminally responsible. Second, assisting victims. 3, preventing abuses. And 4, promoting partnerships with national and international organizations. In the enforcement pillar, an essential element in our strategy is the Mobile Inspection Group, an interagency task force composed of labor inspectors, prosecutors, and federal police agents. This group is charged with conducting operations in hard-to-reach areas and rescuing workers in situations of forced labor or modern slavery. Since its creation, it's impressive, the mobile group has liberated thousands of individuals working in degrading conditions. To assist these operations, Brazil employs the Radar do Trabalho Escravo, which is a forced labor radar, innovative monitoring tool that uses data analytics to identify risks and target enforcement operations more precisely. This makes our efforts more effective, optimizes available resources, and ensures that law enforcement serves the most vulnerable workers. The question about artificial intelligence may also help us to promote the SDGs. On the economic front of enforcement, our legislation publicly exposes employers who exploit forced labor through the so-called dirty list, lista suja, a tool that ensures transparency and promotes good practices in the private sector. In the assistance pillar, the Brazilian government provides financial support to rescue victims. Workers who are rescued are entitled to receive unemployment insurance, which guarantees their immediate subsistence after being freed. They are entitled to up to 3 installments of unemployment insurance, which helps them to rebuild their lives and seek new opportunities for decent work. This benefit is an important step towards helping workers reintegrate into the labor market and restores their dignity after undergoing such a traumatic experience. In the prevention pillar, we recognize that the fight against forced labor requires more than law enforcement and assistance to victims. The national plan promotes economic and social alternatives for vulnerable workers, including job training and productive inclusion programs. This will ensure that those who have been rescued or at risk have access to decent employment and opportunities for reintegration. All these actions are most effective when we collaborate with national and international organizations, which forms the basis of our 4th pillar. International cooperation, particularly with the International Labour Organization, ILO, continues to enhance our capacity for crime fighting and enforcement. Raising social awareness is another effective way to leverage international cooperation, as it educates the public about the seriousness of forced labor, encourages crime reporting, and ensures victim protection. We also believe in international cooperation to address situations where Brazilian nationals may be subject to forced labor in other countries, including in developed countries, as we know that migrants, as was already mentioned here, are a particularly vulnerable group due to unstable immigration status, language barriers, and lack of social networks. And indeed, in the context of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we have invested in some safe spaces within consulates and embassies where there is capacity building activities, training the language, and interaction with NGO and civil society that are very crucial for that. And allow me now to come back to the US-Brazil Partnership for Workers' Rights. This initiative has been invaluable in addressing the challenges and efforts to strengthen workers' rights in both countries. Specifically regarding forced labor, this year we are planning to launch a call to action aimed at the international community and the private sector, seeking to mobilize greater resources to bolster initiatives combating forced labor. As I conclude, let me repeat that Brazil's commitment is clear. We will not rest until forced labor is completely eradicated. In Brazil, with the support of tools such as the Forced Labor Radar, the Mobile Inspection Group, National Plan, we will continue to stand firm in defense of human dignity. As through the US-Brazil Partnership for Workers' Rights, we will keep strengthening international cooperation to ensure a safe, fair, and non-exploitative working environments for all citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you.